Welcome, everyone. My name is Inge Riest. I'm the director of the Center for the History of Collecting here at the Frick Collection and Frick Art Reference Library. I couldn't be more delighted to see so many people here interested in hearing the conversation among these three friends this evening. This is a kind of new idea for us. It's a lovely collaboration between our center and the curatorial department, which has been doing so many wonderful events, lectures, etc., in relation to the exhibition of Tom and Janine Hill's sculptures and works of art, and paintings and works of art downstairs in the galleries and in the cabinet room. But this is a new kind of experiment for the center, which is, I hope, a way for all of you to enjoy the insights of collectors and see how they communicate not only with one another, but how they see communications among the works of art that they own and that they maybe even admire elsewhere and don't own in some instances. I think our panelists don't need any formal introduction. You all know who they are. Tom Hill, financier and great art collector, Richard Feigen, a renowned art dealer and collector, and Jock Reynolds, the director of the Yale University Art Gallery, who collects in a different sphere and can give us insights in collecting connections of another sort. As I was musing this morning on collecting connections, because I should add that I have not invited these gentlemen to just talk randomly about art collecting, because we'd be here all night and we'd lose our focus, at least I know I would. So we really wanted to hone in on how collectors see these connections between works of art across time, across geographical boundaries, or maybe not in all instances, and how they really bring a personal, often thought-provoking point of view to observing works of art. So this got me thinking, as we wander around the galleries of the Frick Collection, certainly when I do, I try to ask myself, what connections did Henry Clay Frick see? Because his daughter tells us that he used to go down almost nightly and take in the beauties of his art collection, and surely he did form connections. Did he look at his Veronese, Wisdom and Strength, and compare it to a sculpture by Palaiuolo of Hercules or a sculpture of Eve? But the sad thing is, we don't really know, because we have a vast archive, but that archive does not contain records of Henry's thinking about his connections of his works of art in his collection. And the first formal photographs that were taken of the collection were in 1927, almost 8 years after he died. So tonight we have a rare opportunity to be able to hear from the horses' mouths how these connections can be formed. And I think it's wonderful, and it will perhaps make up a little bit for the loss of knowing what Henry Clay Frick thought. So we'll begin now, and we'll do so taking Tom Hill's idea, which I thought was a brilliant one, that we'll begin with some visuals. Each one of our panelists has chosen two works of art to draw your attention to a comparative way of thinking, and that's how we'll proceed for the rest of the panel discussion.
Thank you, Inga. We're not only friends, but Richard has sold me a lot of paintings. And Jock, when he asks to borrow any work of art, he is irresistible. So, it sometimes takes a long time to get them back from the Yale Museum. So I'm going to talk very briefly about two bronzes. One is downstairs. It's an Adrian de Vries. And I'm going to talk about another bronze. And I'm going to show you. Which is a de Kooning clam digger. Now, you might ask, what do these bronzes have in common? First, Both of the sculptors are Dutch. Second, both were leaving their native land, leaving the Netherlands. In the case of De Vries, this particular bronze was cast in Milan, and of course de Kooning left the Netherlands and came to the United States. So they were both what I would call immigrants who left. Third, they both were focused on the model. And you might say that there's a common denominator between both of these. They are rough, they are strong, and in my mind, they're equivalent of a punch in the nose, maybe even a punch in the stomach. One thing that we have done with these two bronzes in our apartment is juxtapose them. And we have a Carl Andre on the floor, raw steel, connecting these two bronzes. So there is like a runway connecting two sculptures 400 years apart, almost to the day they were cast. And in our apartment, we want this dialogue. We have no idea whether de Kooning actually spent time in front of De Vries. But my bet is that he was very aware of the history of sculpture and the history of De Vries. And I think tonight we're going to have an opportunity to talk about not only how collectors make connections between works of art, but also how artists make connections. And virtually every artist that I've had extensive conversations with have known the history of art. So whether it's Lichtenstein, Warhol, I mean, if you asked Andy who was the artist he wanted to be, he said Bronzino, because Bronzino painted all these portraits of the Medicis. And think about what Andy was doing. But then you asked him, well, what artist do you admire the most? And he said Piero della Francesca, because of light, shadows. So on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Richard. Again, the connection here is collectors making and establishing links, and then artists being influenced. So Richard.
Does this thing, how do I make it work? It's on.
It's on.
Oh, okay. Well,
do you want me to advance?
what, oh, I see. Yeah. I chose two paintings because, for two reasons. Number one, I have always contended, as it exists in our home, that contemporary things and old things can work very well together. One by one, a lot of younger collectors have started to feel the same way. And that is a general reason for pairing these things, but more specifically is the reason of they're being thematically related. Now, this painting on the left is a 15th century German painting by a artist who was called the Master of the Holy Kinship. Now, it is very, very brutal. It is so, and all these Maccabees are being absolutely tortured. The painting on the left. And the painting on the right is by Max Beckmann, which is hanging in our home. It is the most brutal Beckmann that exists, because it was painted just after he fled Germany from the Nazis, who had taken all his professorship and all the things away from him. Although he was not Jewish, he had to flee. And this is the first painting that he painted after he fled. And he fled to Amsterdam and Paris and Amsterdam. But in a way, another way, that painting was exhibited recently. I've only, I've owned it for, I don't know what, 30-odd years. I've only lent it twice with trepidation. It is very violent. It was in this big exhibition at the Louvre, I think it was last year, of German paintings from 1800 on. And in the end, the show was blasted in Germany. And I think the reason is that this Bird's Hell by Beckmann is such an angry painting, and such a bloody painting, and people being tortured, and these Nazi winged birds are there and so on. And it's the only really, I'd say, overtly political painting that Beckmann ever painted. But in a funny way, it doesn't hang now with the Master of the Holy Kinship, which is a late 15th century German painting. But the relationship, to me, I mean, Beckmann had a source in medieval German art, and he acknowledged that source. A lot of artists do not. For instance, but Rothko told me how influenced he was by some of the 14th and 15th century, how much he liked these early paintings, and they really relate to his work. The other pair of paintings, which we opted not to show, was a work that by a Rothko, a beautiful Rothko, which I sold to the National Gallery in Berlin in 1967, and I had that paired up with a Giotto, because Mark Rothko told me of his respect for Giotto. But the fact is that more and more collectors of contemporary artists are acknowledging their relationship to these things. Some even are overt about it, and how they hang together. Now, the painting of this torture of the Maccabees by the Master of the Holy Kinship, that painting was in an exhibition we had of medieval German art, and it was bought by a collector of contemporary art. And I'm reminded of the fact that when I had a beautiful Rubens oil sketch, I thought of Tom here, because I could see the relationship with his bronzes. And you know, these things do not live in a vacuum. I mean, to me, the Bird's Hell hangs very well with contemporary art in my home. So I won't go into the whole complex iconography of the Beckmann, which is very, very complicated, but very valid. There are often biblical references in his work. There are analogies that are even more eloquent than this one, but I didn't have any digital images. They're paintings from 1917 to 1921, where you could almost be looking at a medieval German painting. So the relationship is not only thematic, but in fact, in a way, it's stylistic too. So now I will let Jock take over.
I got it. Okay, I'm going to show you two groups of work by Judith Shea, a sculptor I've known for many, many years, and I want to sort of echo what Tom said, which is that being an artist myself, I have to say I've hardly known any artist since I've been involved as a museum director who hasn't spent a great deal of time in museum collections looking at art. I think all artists do this. Some admit their influences more than others, but it happens all of the time. It's an artist's way of reading visually and understanding how things are made. Now, Judith Shea, I'm going to show you these first two paired figures. And before I describe them briefly, I just want to say that she's an artist I've first met in the early 80s when my wife and I were artists in residence at MIT in 1982, and she was being shown that year. Since then, I've followed her career and watched her be in residence at the St. Gaudens Memorial and take the influence of St. Gaudens into her work. I've seen her next go to Chesterwood and see how Daniel Chester French influenced her and how she dealt with portraiture influenced by those artists. And then she went to the Academy of Rome in 1994 to study Bernini and Michelangelo. She's been looking at figuration across time for many, many years. And then for a while, I didn't see her work. And then one day at the end of 2009, 2010, I received an invitation from Judith to go to a junior college gallery out in Long Island where she was exhibiting what she called the Legacy Collection. I went out on the last day of the show and encountered about a dozen of these figures. And these two figures, the two on the left are simply called twins. The two on the right are called Shock and Awe. It's a little hard to see from the slide, but you see they're looking up. And if you look carefully at their shoulders, you would see white and charcoal dust on them. And these faces are quite anxious. It's important to know that Judith had also recently gone to Oaxaca, where she had gone to the Spanish colonial churches and looked at the folk saints that had been carved in wood and painted with polychrome paints. But what's most important to know that Judith lived on Chambers Street, 3 blocks from the Twin Towers the day they went down. She was in her home, heard this huge concussion, and all of a sudden, all around her, everything was white powder. You couldn't see a single thing from outside her windows. And she waited and waited. It took a long time. Finally, she saw the silhouette of a fireman running by and opened the door, and he screamed at her to stay inside. Another number of minutes went on, and finally, as the dust settled, she was looking at the Brooks Brothers store across from her at the mannequins and the word Legacy Collection. It took her about 5 years to process how she really felt about that incident. And this group of figures, almost a dozen or more of them, became that show. And we purchased these beautiful pair for Yale. Now, we also then thought about how they might be shown. So the first time we showed them, this is as you approach our Louis Kahn building, we put them right in the front window, much as you would have seen them as mannequins or figures at Brooks Brothers or any store. And what was wonderful about this is you saw the light of day move up and down these figures and reveal them in spectacular ways that's different from the static light of a normal museum lighting. And people came up, and they also looked up, thought about the Kahn building. They looked up beyond the windows itself. It puts you in an interesting relationship with architecture. After that showing, we brought them inside. They reside at this very moment inside our Louis Kahn building, looking up into its very heavy vaulted tetrahedral ceiling. And again, they have a completely different kind of feeling and an emotional situation where you can walk around them and think about this incredible incident. So they've been wonderful figures to have also as we continue to contemplate the trauma of that huge event and what it's meant to us culturally, politically, and personally. And for her, 3 blocks away, it was deeply personal. More recently, Judith made a self-portrait entitled Still Standing. She's now about my age, in her mid-60s, and has endured as an artist for a long time. And this self-portrait shows her with great sense of determination, just staring straight out at whoever's contemplating her. And I asked her recently about the pose and where it came from, what it might have been influenced by, and she sent me these 2 images of Cypriotic figures from the Metropolitan Museum. Now, if that doesn't make it clear how artists mine museum collections, I don't know what does. Thank you.
Jock, can you hit the next one should be a blank. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So now we're just going to, I'm going to ask questions here and there, and I hope that all 3 of our panelists will just jump in and not necessarily feel that we have to go in a sequence one after another. Just as a general point, it certainly is true that our conversation this evening is predicated on the fact that all 3, whether for public institutions or for themselves, all 3 of the gentlemen with me here collect, maybe not omnivorously, but certainly in many different categories, different media across different centuries. And I just wanted to ask each one of you to elaborate a little bit, very briefly, on what led your journey of collecting in that direction, because certainly there are collectors of no lesser stature, really, who become ultra specialists in one area. So what made you almost an omnivore of a collector?
Well, I'll start. I've always been interested in the human body. And in the early 90s, Janine, my wife, who's in the front row, and I said, well, if you could wave a magic wand and think about sculptural reflections of the human body, where would you start? And we said, Greek and Roman. The problem with collecting Greek and Roman is you don't know where these sculptures came from. Provenance issues, just look at what happened with the Getty and friends of ours, including Michael Steinhardt, where Italy and Greece and other countries have a long reach. And so we said, what's the closest derivative of Greek and Roman? And as you all know, in the 1400s and extending into the 1500s, in Italy, they were uncovering all of these incredible Greek and Roman. So why does the Vatican Museum have the Laocoon and all of these incredible marbles and bronzes? It's because they were uncovering them. And the Renaissance really started with sculpture. In fact, the Metropolitan Museum did a show, Portraiture, where the basic theme was Donatello, and the sculptures really led the artists doing paintings in the Renaissance. And in fact, the Louvre just had a show called The Springtime of the Renaissance, echoing the same theme. So we said, well, what about Renaissance bronzes? Again, if we want to reflect the human body. And this was mid-90s. And at the same time, because in the late 60s, up at Harvard, I had the chance to get to know Andy Warhol. Warhol, interestingly enough, this was before he was shot in '68, would come to Harvard to talk to students. And as you know, Andy had a curious way of getting ideas. You know, he would try to get ideas from other people. And so he would hang around with students, usually late at night, with pinball machines going and, you know, a greasy spoon. And you could have a kind of conversation with him because he wasn't too talkative. You know, he'd have his tape recorder there and his, you know, Polaroid. And he'd be, you know. But at the same time, I always thought if we were going to have a collection, we would have a collection of Warhols. And so when we bought our first Renaissance bronze in the mid-90s, which is a Lesueur Venus, which is downstairs, which has a royal inventory stamp, Louis XIV. It was in Louis XIV's collection. Within a week of having bought that, we bought our first Warhol, which was a soup can, a hand-painted soup can from '62. And in fact, the De Vries Bacchic man is in front of two Warhols. So we said, well, let's go down the path of Renaissance bronzes, and then let's, in addition to Warhol, identify a handful of artists that we want to collect in depth. And rather than having one of each, we said, let's go deep. And so our definition of deep is at least 4 works by the artist. So whether it's Francis Bacon, Warhol, Lichtenstein, Twombly, we have at least 4 of their works. And it was only later when I saw Richard's collection of gold grounds that I said, wouldn't it be interesting to have gold grounds, and then we extended that to Rubens. So we have 3 Rubens oil sketches. Richard sold me 2 of the 3 oil sketches, plus 2 paintings, one of which is up at the Met, hanging in the Rubens room. So our collection started with the human body, then it went into bronzes, then it went into 8 artists that we collected in depth. That's extended now to 10. And then it went into old masters, gold grounds, and 5 Rubens. So that's our story. Richard.
Well, there are not many collectors in the world who can bridge these gaps. I mean, little by little, we're adding to that number. But it seemed to me, although needless to say, I don't know as much about Andy Warhol's work as Tom does.
I'm not sure you want to.
I'm very often iconoclast, so sometimes I disagree with the market. But there are a few, one by one, these collectors are looking instead of just listening. And my problem is, of course, that as works disappear from the market, and now it's getting worse and worse in terms of gold grounds or old masters. When I bought my first gold ground painting, meaning Italian painting from the 14th and 15th century, I practically had no competition. Then all of a sudden, along came an Italian collector from Milan, and he started entering the market. And of course, I was easily trumped financially, so that he formed this collection. And then he died. I thought, oh boy, now I have it all to myself. And then along came another Milanese collector, and that was bad news for me. And finally, he died. I said, oh, now I've got a chance. But all of a sudden, along came this collector who has an apartment in New York and who lives in Chile, whose name is Saye. And he has formed this huge collection of gold ground paintings. Meanwhile, things of quality have disappeared from the market. In terms of accessibility, if they do, the prices are ridiculous compared to the contemporary art. I mean, truly ridiculous. It's like some of these apartments are selling for $100 million, and they're all in these new buildings, and it's all this money which is seeping in from Russia and China and the Gulf and everywhere. So the party's almost over as far as I'm concerned. I just can't compete in that league. But there were reasons why I called Tom with that first Rubens oil sketch, because the way the line works, the power of it, and so on, seemed to me so related to the Renaissance bronzes, of which he was already a very eminent collector. I don't know, maybe the eminent collector. So he picked up the ball very quickly. Not too many people do that. They read the newspaper or they attend an auction and they see a Richter bringing $30, $40, $50 million. A lot of these people are, in my view, collecting with their ears and not their eyes. Once in a while, you run into somebody like Janine and Tom, and there are a couple of people like that in the world, but not many, who can bridge this gap and see the relationships and get excited by these earlier things, which are not in the. Is that me or you? But some of this stuff is rather tough. When the Louvre organized the exhibition, the recent exhibition, I think it closed last year, of German painting, German romantic painting, I suppose. And I said I changed my mind. I decided I wasn't going to lend Bird's Hell. I'm sorry, but I couldn't. And all of a sudden, I got a call from the director of the Louvre. Richard, you can't do that. It's in our catalog, and it's critical to that. So I finally said, okay. I mean, removing it from where it hangs in my stairwell was a major job. I don't even know how they did it, because thank God I wasn't even around. But I could. Then all of a sudden, the show opened, and it had a lot of works by Caspar David Friedrich and so on, and they did a very good job of covering German Romanticism from 1800 to, let's say, to date. Well, the show got blasted in Germany. They hated the show, and they really wreaked hell and their vengeance on the Louvre for doing it, because they didn't want, the last painting when you left the show was Bird's Hell. And the image, I suppose they were afraid people got was that German art is brutal. Well, but it went down very well in France. But, but anyway, these analogies are not just imaginary, as I say. The artists acknowledge their debt to earlier painting, in this case Beckmann with medieval German art. And it seemed to me ridiculous to rule anything out. I mean, there's certain pockets in which I'm interested. So you see a group of paintings here and a group of paintings there. Basically, it is about a sort of romanticism. And I'm delighted that Yale, my alma mater, has this great museum, which Jock is almost completely responsible for gaining recognition. I mean, what he's done is just unbelievable. And it's the oldest museum, I think, in the country, isn't it? Yeah, 1833? 32. And he keeps finding stuff in the basement you won't believe. I mean, they found 2 Fra Angelicos, a Velasquez. I don't know what else could turn up. But Jock has done an unbelievable job. So now the world basically knows about the Yale Art Gallery. When I was there, it was very neglected by Yale, and all these things remained in the basement. Nobody knew about them. So they have an incredible teaching resource up there. I mean, they can show the undergraduates as well as graduates these relationships. No, very few museums can do that. So, Jock, here, you take it.
Richard, can I ask you one little follow-up question? You, when you were in Chicago, you had quite a lot of then contemporary art in your collection, did you not? I mean, of Francis Bacon and I was wondering what kind of connections, if any, you would draw with the, let's say, a Francis Bacon Pope or Beckmann that you would later collect, and that kind of brutal image.
Well, lately, these things, they used to be called contemporary art. Now they're called, I guess, I don't know what the auction houses call that. They're already modern. They're canonized now. Again, you see in Beckmann this very strong, romantic, powerful imagery, which I'm more personally attracted to than I am to abstraction. It doesn't mean I rule abstraction out. Albers, for instance, in 1968, I did an exhibition because the riots in Chicago were brutal concerning the 1968 Democratic Convention, and the police were brutal with the kids that had assembled there. And I had a Klaus Oldenburg exhibition scheduled for October, and Klaus, who was out there as a reporter, to draw things, he said, "Richard, I can't do this. I can't honor Chicago. I'll have to postpone my exhibition." So I thought, well, meanwhile, a bunch of sort of second and third tier abstract expressionists were camping out in East Hampton, and they decided they organized a boycott of Chicago. They tried to get every artist to sign this manifesto saying that they would not allow their work to be shown in Chicago for 10 years. I told these guys, who are you bothering? Mayor Daley? He couldn't care less. But you're hurting your comrades. They're the ones who... Anyway, we organized this exhibition called Richard J. Daley. And the only artist, Barnett Newman made me a huge sculpture, which is now in the Art Institute of Chicago. The only artist who would not participate in any way or send a word or a telegram or anything was Joseph Albers. And Albers explained to me, I am not political. He was the only artist. But the impact of all those artists participating really was infinitely greater than if all of a sudden art disappeared from Chicago, which would have been very, very convenient for Mayor Daley. So, but Bacon fit right into this kind of, let us say, I won't say violent streak in my taste, but I mean, it was clearly very powerful and very romantic. And so I went around and bought Bacon's. I never met Bacon himself. And I went around and bought them. And in my show, they were priced, the small screaming men and all that were $900. The most expensive thing was this big Pope of 1953, one of the original, I think there were 7 popes, which I managed to sell to the museum in Minneapolis for $3,500. But people, eventually, the market caught up with Bacon, as it seems to eventually catch up with everything, you know.
Jock, I wonder, as we talk about your journey as a more or less omnivore collector who can make all these connections, you clearly are in a somewhat different situation because of being in a public institution and having certain obligations and the rest. I wonder if you can talk about how free or not so free you feel about being able to do that.
Well, certainly when you're a director of a public institution or a museum, I think you, first of all, you have, as a director, hopefully you do possess some true knowledge of art, some passion for it, some expertise, hopefully a good eye. But really your primary responsibility is to hire the very best people you can as curators and do everything you can to support them. And that's not to say that you yourself as director with an expertise can't exercise judgments, do acquisitions, do scholarship and shows. And for me, the chance to try that out came at my prep school alma mater, Andover, where I'd enjoyed a wonderful youthful experience being exposed to the great collections of the Addison Gallery of American Art, which are just an unparalleled kind of opportunity for high school kids. And I'd volunteered later in life to serve my alma mater, and they, for some reason, asked me to come and spend a sabbatical year as director. I'd never thought of being a museum director, never planned to be. But right away, you realize a tremendous responsibility to these amazing things that people have given to the institution over time, and that you're, a curator, part of that word means to care for, the original word of curate, and that there's a real responsibility that goes with that. And so you start to think of overarching concerns of what one needs to look out for. And particularly at Andover, where I was, I knew a lot about American art, contemporary art, photography. That was not as much of a challenge as going to Yale, where all of a sudden I was in a 10-department encyclopedia collection amongst people who knew whole lots more about their areas than I did. And I needed to really figure out how to help and support them. At the same time, you get, as a director, a chance to look at other issues of what I would call lacuna or neglect. And any of you who've been to one of the prep schools or a lot of the universities in America may remember that there was a time when most of them were all male or all female. Those who went to Andover in my time, it was all male. Many of you who went to Harvard or Yale, it was all male. So when both Andover and Yale became co-ed, one of the first things one noticed, if you pay any attention at all, is that there was a tremendous underrepresentation of women artists in those collections. Now, how that came to be, we can discuss, but frankly, when you all of a sudden have 50% of your students being women, you would like to be able to see yourself in these collections. So just to give you an example, when I came to Yale, we had no works really by Eva Hesse, Judy Pfaff, Nancy Graves, Jennifer Bartlett, Jessica Stockholder, it goes on and on. These are just Yale women alumna, some of the most distinguished women artists of in the country. We were very underrepresented with other major artists, so women artists. So we started, to really work on rectifying that. We did that at Andover as well, but at Yale in recent years, we've rectified that with major purchases of work by all of those artists, or gifts of them in many cases, but also added works by people like Louise Bourgeois, Louise Nevelson, Elizabeth Catlett, Marisol, Dorothea Tanning, Carrie Mae Weems, Cindy Sherman. It goes on and on and on. And frankly, that was something that needed to be done, and that many of us paid attention to, whether it was in prints and department photography, drawings, painting, sculpture, in lots of areas. Now, at the same time, you also get to work with the likes of someone like Larry Cantor, who's well known to these two characters here, who we were able to pluck out of the Lehman collection. And Larry's the kind of person that makes you realize when you have a curator who has an incredible knowledge of a particular area of art and can not only produce a great Frangelico retrospective for the Met, but come to your university gallery and for the first time look at the collection with a knowledge and expertise that brings about whole new attributions. And more than that even, too, a way to teach with those, you realize that you're really in deep, deep clover. And those are the kinds of people you want to support, and frankly, those are the kinds of people who bring to you collectors, dealers, people who want to help augment your collection and enrich this. So if you're doing your job as a museum director in a public collection, you're not just looking to your own personal narrow interest, because no one should collect just with a personal taste for a public institution alone. You have to have a broad array of great expertise working for and with you, and to make sure, I think, that your curators always feel to some degree you're putting them and their needs first and that of your educators. So that's, we can talk more about that, but I just cite the example of trying to rectify just the gender issue alone was a major thing that's brought great gratification, I think, to both constituencies, and both at Andover and Yale.
That's great. I'd like to shift just a little bit to think about display of collections in a somewhat more specific way, and ask if our collectors here are sometimes, we're talking about connections, but sometimes are you tempted to isolate a category of art? I mean, here at the Frick, for example, the Fragonard Room is definitely an isolation of a certain category of art, and in some museums and in some private collections, one work of art is enshrined in a certain place. William Randolph Hearst, for example, created whole environments at his various houses that have remarkable consistency in the type of art that he installed in those houses. And yet, we are talking more about connections across different areas. Tom, have you ever been tempted to put a single little area of your apartment to dedicate that to one type of art?
Well, one advantage of collecting bronzes is that, with the exception of the De Vries Bacchic Man, they are mobile, so you can pick them up and move them around. We have tried in our apartment to have themes. So just as Denise Allen did an amazing job in the gallery upstairs of having sacred objects. I mean, she has our Algardi crucifixion next to a Fontana crucifixion with a Rubens oil sketch Assumption, with any number, with the Giovanni De Paolo that George Wachter, thank you very much, at Sotheby's sold us. But what we've tried to do is have connections, but having our bronzes here at the Frick has opened up my mind to completely new connections. Because when you walk downstairs, what do you see first? You see the Tetroda, striding warrior, and then you see the Jean Bologna model of Mars. And we've never had those two facing off against each other. And then you walk to the right, and you see a whole line of Jean Bologna, where two autograph Jean Bolognas, the bull and the horse, and then the Venus Urania right there, autograph Jean Bologna, and then to the right, all of the Antonio Suzzini and Gianfrancesco cast together. So again, thank you, Denise, because the way you displayed the bronzes and the advantage of not only no vitrines, because in our apartment there's obviously no vitrines, but no bases, no sockles. You get to see the bronzes in a completely different way. So when the bronzes come back on June 15th, we're going to be moving them around and experimenting with new juxtapositions. I have to say, when you have big paintings, a Francis Bacon large painting weighs 200 pounds. So you're not going to be moving that around. But we have changed some of the juxtapositions with the paintings over time.
And actually, Jock, you've just completed, well, not just completed, but fairly recently completed that spectacular reinstallation in the new wing at Yale. And I wonder how the juxtapositions you came upon for that arose.
Well, again, this notion that too much is being attributed to me needs to be dismissed right now, because an awful lot of that beauty of what's happened in those three historic buildings is that the heads of all those departments and their junior colleagues, and in many cases Yale students who have studied with those people, have been involved in all those installations. The wall colors, the density of what's hung, where it's hung, how often it changes, how the juxtapositions move around. That's something every one of these departments is leading as an effort to make our collections more fully and readily accessible. I think it's actually really important whenever possible myself when it comes to installations. I want to establish what I think of as sort of visual poetics between works of art. I want them to resonate, even if they seem a little like, why in the world would that have worked, but it did, is a wonderful thing to come across when you hang and own works of art either privately or publicly. And I just want to say that, you know, when I think of mentors, people who I've admired in the field, one of the museum directors I most admired is Jim Demetri, who may be known to some of you. He started out first at the Pasadena Art Museum years ago with Walter Hopps, and was at the Des Moines Art Museum, and then at the Hirshhorn. And Jim was one of the first museum directors I know who really made the effort to understand what was happening across all of America. At the same time, he was showing and buying Bacon and Lucian Freud before almost anyone, but maybe this guy over here. And when I came to Washington to run the Washington Project for the Arts of Washington, D.C., artists organization in the 80s after having been at MIT, I'll never forget of all the museum directors who welcomed me to town and wanted to meet me, and I went to their offices, all of them talked about the politics of Washington and what this, that, and the other. Demetrian had in his office 4x5 chromes of all the artists I had studied with at UC Davis, Wiley, Arneson, Wayne Thiebaud. He wanted to know specifically what I thought of different works that either were in the collection or that he was thinking of buying. I thought, now that's the kind of director you want to have. And when you saw how he installed that collection, I had never until that time seen someone do it with that kind of visual, poetic intelligence and a knowledge of what was happening in modern contemporary. And I think a lot of us, you know, hold to people in the field who we admire. It's one of the great things about working in a teaching museum is you can work with curators and faculty members who really can inspire you. And that's the other thing we've tried to do more and more at Yale is give students a responsibility. We've now are on our 9th student-curated shows that go in the same galleries. And as I often tell them, I said, if you hang a painting wrong, no one goes home in a body bag, you know. And if you can't make some mistakes in university or college or prep school life, you're probably not going to have a very interesting life and not have learned much. So even when students need to be guided a bit, which often these kids don't need that much of, you want to give them primary early experiences. We were talking just earlier before we came on stage at how young the students in Paul Sachs's course at Harvard were in the 20s. Most of those people who came out of there and ran museums, whether it was Alfred Barr at MoMA or Charles Sawyer at Andover or Chick Austin at Wadsworth, on and on, they were all under 30 when they got those jobs. Why don't we think that younger people can't be mentored and given responsibility in this field and brought up sooner and given more options? So that's where, you know, I have to say I've been very blessed and felt very comfortable working in this kind of learning environment where you can share art both publicly and in an active learning situation. And that brings with it very interesting ways in which collections can be put to use.
But Jock, you know, basically you're sitting there on this extraordinary teaching resource, and you and I have talked endlessly. We don't have a training ground for art history. We don't have a first-rate art history department in any museum, any university in the country. The situation at Harvard was different. Most of the leading museum directors came out of Paul Sachs's course of connoisseurship and museum studies at Harvard. Today we don't have that, because in the middle 70s, all of a sudden, political correctness, gender studies, theories, ideas, the object was considered elitist. I've been on panels even at Harvard, and I mentioned connoisseurship, and I got wheeled on by this fierce, this fierce curator saying you're an elitist, you know, and as a result, although Jock has this unbelievable museum up at Yale, which is greater than any other university museum in the world, one of the leading museums, which what he's done there has brought it into the sunlight. But the fact is, well, no, this Larry Cantor, who is, in my view, a genius, all right, and he is the chief curator at the Yale Art Gallery. He is the greatest authority, in my view, and a lot of other people's view, on early Italian painting.
How did he help you see your collection differently when he borrowed it? Tell him about that.
Well, I got to look at it, because those early Italian paintings sit in my dining room in darkness. I'm redoing the lighting this summer, but they're all jammed in one single room, which has humidification, because early panel paintings are very, very vulnerable to climate change, and you need humidification. It's the only room in my house that's humidified. But I got my first look was at Yale, when they were hanging in a way that I could actually see them. But you know.
We hope you'll like to see them that way for a very long time.
But Larry Cantor is not even on the Yale faculty. If one wanted to take an art history course, you can't take one with Larry Cantor, because they're all involved with, there are 29 courses in African culture, one in Caribbean art history. No, I mean, I'm beginning to sound like the Dick Cheney of the art world.
Yeah, take him off that subject.
Don't get me wound up, because I mean, you know, all the universities, they may have one person or two people, but nowhere is there a great art history department, because the study of individual objects, of the beauty of these things, which really are all we're going to have left when all the bombs and the aircraft carriers and goddamn things are rusted. These things will still be around as trophies of our civilization. And yet there isn't, if you look for courses in connoisseurship in this great university with this great art gallery, you're going to find practically nothing. Now,
I think we'll give him a rest. But I'd like to just talk very briefly about the people in your collecting lives who have sort of provoked you to make interesting connections that you might not have otherwise thought of. We know that for Tom, it certainly is his wife, Janine, a lot of the time, and I did clear it with him that I could ask this question, whether he and Janine have ever had moments when they see connections very differently and don't particularly agree. I also know other collectors have played a strong role for you, and you have play dates for your sculptures and things like that. So, if you'll talk a little.
Let's start with the partnership I have with Janine, where before we buy any major work, we have a discussion, and Janine was vested on day one with veto power. And I'll never forget, I came home, I think this was 1999, and I said, I've just seen this amazing Warhol, which is 6 feet by 7 feet. It is an electric chair. And we had, 2 young daughters at home, and Janine said, I don't even have to go to Mnuchin's gallery to see this. I don't want it in the home. And I said, okay, how about when our youngest goes off to college? And so when our youngest went off to college, meanwhile, this painting had already been sold. It's in the Eli Broad's collection in Los Angeles. I got my electric chair. And in fact, the one that I have, I like better than Eli's. So one thing you got to do is know how each of the works of art fit together. And it goes the other way, where we had this amazing Rothko, and Janine loved that painting. And I said, Janine, it violates the rule of in-depth. I said, we either have to buy 3 more, in which case you got to have a Rothko room. You know, we already got a Rothko chapel down in Houston, and I don't think we're going to do that, or we got to sell it. And if we sell it, you know, we're going to buy another Bacon. And Janine reluctantly agreed to that. In terms of, because it's really the only abstraction that we have, everything else, even the Twombly blackboard, which you see downstairs, is not an abstraction, and the Bryce Mardens we have are not abstractions. But in the bronzes, we're really fortunate, and it's a little bit going back to what Richard said when he was starting buying gold grounds. It was a very limited marketplace, very few buyers. And when we started in the mid-90s, you could count the serious collectors on 2 hands. And you had Bob Smith, who at that time was chairman of the National Gallery in Washington. You had an occasional collector. You had Prince Hans Adam at Liechtenstein, occasionally the Aga Khan, but there were very few serious collectors. And you had free range. And the interesting thing is we all knew what were the bronzes in the other collections. And we would have conversations with, I mean, for instance, Claudia Quentin, who had her bronzes shown here, the Quentin collection. She became a close friend, and we would actually go back and forth where, you know, she has a Jean Bologna Mars, and we would compare our 2 Marses. She has a Hercules and Antaeus, again, 1450. We have another cast of that same model, and we would compare them. And so we've developed more friendships with collectors. I think we wouldn't be able to have put this collection together, though, without the curators. And if you take Denise Allen or take Claudia Kriese-Gersch at the Kunsthistorische, Nick Penny when he was at the National Gallery in DC, he's now director of the National Gallery in London. You know, the conversations that we've had, Ian Wardropper, you know, when he was at the Met, now the Frick, experts on bronzes, and to be able to tap into their brains and then to rely upon dealers who actually know what they're doing. Because the 2 biggest risks in collecting bronzes are first fakes and then false attributions. And you really better know what you're doing because you can be stuck with lemons.
Yeah. Let me just add something else, since you've talked about the value of other people who advise you. I mean, looking out into this room, there are many of you I recognize who serve as trustees on not only this museum's board, but others. And as much as you value and want to support the knowledge of your curators and work with them, at the Yale Art Gallery, and I think this is true of almost all museums, you want your board of directors also to be people who have a passionate interest in art and hopefully a great expertise. And in many cases, these collections have grown not simply through purchases. You know, Yale, for example, in Andover, probably 95% of the works in the collections come as gifts from alums, from patrons, from parents, from those over time who give their collections. But what was really interesting is you want on your board, I think, and this is true, I think we've sort of done it at Yale, is we have about 40 people on our governing board, and each department of these 10 departments probably has at least 3 people who collect deeply in those areas, have a really strong knowledge of the field, know where things are, can give our curators and me background knowledge, further insights into the works. And so that this sense of what's acquired or what's purchased or what's researched, it becomes a shared activity between those who volunteer to serve our institutions as well as those who are paid to be on the staffs. And I think when I look around the country and think of museums and institutions that are really functioning well, you always find them if they have a strong staff working with a strong board and in a very collegial and productive way, you've got a strong institution. If either side of that gets weakened, you start to have trouble. And just think about that, of the institutions you know, that the leadership issues become dicey and they can devolve into mutual times when things just don't go well for a long period of time. Witness what's happened to the Corcoran Gallery, for example, as opposed to institutions that have been beautifully managed. So those of you in the room who serve as volunteers, know how important your roles are to those of us who work for a salary and, in a sense, are paid to live amongst all this stuff. It's just a ridiculous pleasure and privilege.
That really gives me the most perfect segue. We couldn't have rehearsed it better, hearing Jock observe how many people who know what they're talking about and know collecting are in this audience. I think it's time we open up the questions to those of you who have come here this evening. So I will stop, but I hope that some of you will raise your hands and ask our panelists about their collecting connections.
Even on that train that took you to Warhol, to Motherwell, where's your next stop?
Wait, I can't hear you.
Could you repeat it?
Yeah, Motherwell. If you had kept on going, where do you think you would have gone? Would have been your next contemporary? I'm not clear.
You just can't be heard until you speak at the mic.
Probably not worth listening. My question to you is, I was fascinated to know that you're interested in Warhol, and then you're interested in Motherwell. I just wonder if you'd kept going on that train, what would your next stop have been?
Well, with respect to Warhol, it was more Warhol. So we've got 14. With the respect to Motherwell, just like with the Rothko, we sold it. And to Franz Klein, anything that was Abex other than de Kooning, we sold.
Could you touch on private collectors having their own museums?
Who are you addressing that to? Oh, okay. Well, I don't think there's anything wrong with private collectors establishing museums. We actually be sitting in one that's quite fine that happened that way. but let me say this. I think in this present day and age, there are all too many individual collectors thinking about starting private museums who don't fully understand what's entailed in not just building the building and giving your collection, but what it takes to actually run one of these institutions, how well they need to be endowed and staffed. And if you do something just in your own name, it's much harder to get other people in to support it than if it's affiliated, of course, with a great university or something else or a broader community. So that's a real challenge. And I think one of the reasons we're seeing the rise of this is not just egotism, by people, although there's some of that, seriously. A lot of it, okay. But here's I think that one of the other real reasons. People do not want to give things they love and have lived with to an institution that just puts it in the basement and doesn't use it. And it doesn't come up, it isn't seen, it isn't made accessible. And that's one of the things I have to say both at Andover and Yale, we've made a real effort to make the collections readily accessible. In other words, have enough art handlers, registrars, people who can get the stuff out and bring it forth to rotate the collections or to bring them into classrooms. And that means another kind of commitment to raise funds for staffing that isn't generally the sexy senior professor, senior curator, director. And I think more institutions need to think about that seriously if they want to keep getting wonderful things given to them, that if they're not going to make the work accessible and use it in a truly productive way, they probably aren't going to get it when they're going to go up against the competing institutions that will do that. I personally am very pleased that a lot of the college and university museums have now decided we're going to start sharing our collections more actively with one another, literally single source and not try to monetize our collections. We are free. We don't charge $25 to get in. There's some competitive advantages, frankly, that universities and colleges have that we're going to start to exercise more strongly in the field. And I think, that's sort of our strategy to really sort of say why should works come to a place like Yale or Andover, Princeton, whatever, University of Texas. A lot of people are I think, thinking this way.
one comment, which is private collections that end up as museums have to constantly be thinking about refreshing and making connections. And if you look at Weiler, they succeed just like the Frick succeeds or the Nasher Museum succeeds because they have constant exhibitions that keep their permanent collection fresh by bringing in new material. And you just look at Moritz House, where not only, those incredible works of art came here, but now some Frick paintings are going over there, and constantly having the great works of art refreshed and made relevant by having exhibitions. And I think it's really hard. Look at, Ronald Lauder has done it at the Neue Gallery, but I think it's really hard. And if you have, one of the questions is here, our bronze collection, it needs to be juxtaposed with other works of art. And so the idea of having those bronzes in isolation, it's very sterile. And so, Janine and I are obviously thinking about what you do with these 34 bronzes. And
Tom, don't you think, or at least I think, I don't know how you feel, there are too many museums now. And we don't have enough museum directors. They're being trained nowhere. Now we have vacancies now in Cleveland, Boston, God knows where else, and nobody to take the jobs. And I think a lot of these private museums, frankly, are ego trips. There was a time when being on the board of the Art Institute of Chicago was a social plum. The museum, the symphony orchestra, people would strive. Now, the only social plum is a lot of money. So the entry fee is higher. And where the prices come from are the newspapers. Every time something brings 100 million, 125 million, it breeds another one at 150 million. And the whole thing has become a lottery for financial prestige. Whereas before, it used to be social prestige. Now it's different. I think the Met has done a great job now because the new members of the board, of which my friend Tom is an important member, they're not there because it's a social plum. They're there because they really have some input, and they really know what they're doing. And little by little, that board is being transformed. But I think these museums that are based on some collectors' deep pockets, and they don't add to the wealth of imagery in that particular community. For instance, Los Angeles has too much of the same thing, and they're just adding more. Now, Eli Broad's a friend of mine, but I don't know why that needs a separate museum.
well, my wife and I just got back from Jerusalem, and you think about in limited space, 3 religions, it's all about real estate. And I think the analogy is a lot of museums now are thinking about real estate, and where a lot of museums are running into problems is, oh, we're going to build massive new spaces. And unfortunately, often they don't have the programming and the art to put in the spaces. And I think that's an area of potential risk for museums.
I think it's time for us to adjourn to the garden court for a small reception, and time for you to be able to continue the conversation with our panelists out there. But please first join me in thanking